Good morning. Hudson Taylor was a true hero of the Christian faith, someone who I think of sort of in the way Paul talked about of follow me as I follow Christ. I see Hudson Taylor as someone that we can learn to follow after as he followed Christ. He saw himself as a giant, or sorry, as a weak man who did great things for God because of God being with them. Some of the keys of Hudson Taylor's life were prayer. He would spend hours each morning prayer and reading scripture, and he believed that if God was truly the provider and the one who was trustworthy, then prayer was the key of everything and time with God. He also believed that financially Christ is sufficient for all our needs, that we don't need to use debt to kind of do God's things, but that God can provide for all of our needs. And explicitly can provide. He believed that, I put 1 Corinthians chapter 9, the idea that becoming all things to all people, that by all means possible, some might be saved. Hudson Taylor adapted to Chinese dress, shaved his hair and wore a pigtail and dyed his hair black so that his appearance might not get in the way of the gospel when he was in China. He was extremely conciliatory with other denominations. He was born Methodist, but kind of had more Baptist leanings by the end of his life, but made that not public so that he could try to work with anyone. And at the heart of Hudson Taylor's kind of passion was his driving ambition to reach China with the gospel. At the end of his life, a quote that's attributed to Hudson Taylor is, "If I had 1,000 lives, I'd give them all for China in the sake of the gospel." He believed that the ministry that was just going to the coast of China wasn't enough, but that the unreached interior of China also needed the gospel. And it was his life's ambition to see that happen. So Hudson Taylor was born in 1832 to a devout Methodist family. His father taught him initially and really hammered home the importance of being on time to things. One saying that Hudson Taylor attributed to his father was that if you are 1 minute late to meet 5 people, you've stolen 5 minutes. He really took promptness with seriousness. They would spend evenings where other local pastors would come to their home and talk about the gospel. And around the age of 4 or 5, Hudson Taylor learned about China and the need in China, the millions of people who didn't know about Jesus, and felt like maybe that's where he would like to be sent by God. However, throughout his later school years and early teenage years, he kind of mostly thought that his family was a little stodgy. Instead of going to the church and singing hymns, he would have rather had a nice large house and been having parties and taking a really fast horse out for runs. He thought that their frugal lifestyle was not the best way. He desired to end up being a big fancy businessman. But his sister and his mom had something to say about that. His little sister Amelia was 13. And she thought, well, I want to see Hudson Taylor, take faith seriously, come to know Jesus. So she began praying 3 times a day. And for 6 weeks, she did this before their mother was going on a trip about couple hours out of town to visit friends. And the first night that their mom was gone, their mom felt convicted by God to go to her room and pray for Hudson Taylor. And on that night, Hudson Taylor had gone to his father's study to find something interesting to read. And he wasn't having much luck, but he found this tract and he thought, well, I know what these are. The first half will have an interesting story and the second half will have some moral or sermon. So I'll just take the first half and leave the second half for someone who likes that sort of thing. But while reading, the finished work of Christ, or the phrase, the finished work of Christ, really stuck out to Hudson Taylor. He was he was stricken by the idea that if the work of reconciliation with God was completely finished by Christ, then he could trust in Jesus and believe that what he had done was sufficient. And that night, he came before God um, and professed faith in Jesus, and came to follow him. And he told his sister this the next day and asked to kind of keep it secret so that he could tell their mom when she got home. So when Hudson Taylor's mom arrived home, she ran up to him and embraced him and said, "Son, I'm so happy." Said, how do you know what happened? And did Amelia tell you? She said, "No, I was called to prayer and felt God telling me that you had come to know him." Well, after an experience like this, where his sister had been praying for him for weeks and his mom had been praying for him that night, he really was convicted that prayer was powerful and had an impact. So soon after this, Hudson Taylor was reading China, Its Spiritual Needs by Medhurst, and again felt called that China is where he would like to spend his life's service. So he studied in Hull in order to prepare for missionary service in China. He believed that it was important to live by faith in these days in London when he had some supports, because if he couldn't do it there, he wouldn't be able to in China. So he just ate brown bread and apples because he thought that was the most thrifty way to live. Just drank water, lived in a fairly rundown area of town. They called it Drainside because there was a little canal across the street from where he was living, where all the neighbors would kind of just throw their garbage. It wasn't an especially nice area. During this time, he fell in love with a young lady named Miss Vaughn, Miss V. But they got engaged twice actually, but she wasn't willing to go to China and he was not willing to give up that dream. So they never ended up getting married. And while he was studying, he learned everything he could about China and the Chinese language, along with the biblical languages. So in 1853, the Chinese Evangelization Society, who was sponsoring Taylor's med school, there had been a change of the emperor in China, and they thought this was a good chance. The new emperor was fairly pro-Christian. So they sent Hudson Taylor partway through his studies. On the boat, there was another example of him having the chance to see his faith in action. There were a few different sort of weather patterns that he saw, in prayer, changes happen to, and especially one where there hadn't been wind for days, and they were kind of getting close to getting beached on this reef and getting the boat wrecked. So he suggested to the captain, well, why don't the 5 of us who are Christians on board go to our cabins and pray? And he went to his cabin, started praying, and felt like God was saying, okay, I'm going to send a wind. So he went up on board and said to the first mate, who was kind of a rougher fellow, okay, put down the sails. A wind is coming. God is sending wind. The first mate just thought this was crazy. But a little ripple came, just kind of a ghost wind. So he said, no, pull it down. The wind is coming. And the first mate said, oh, there's nothing. But Hudson Taylor said, pull down the sail, pull down the sail. So they start pulling down the sail. And by the time it was down, a full-blown wind was going through and pulled them just beyond this reef. So that was quite an amazing story and really an encouragement to Hudson Taylor. Well, when he first arrived in China, there were quite a few missionaries stationed in Shanghai, and he just didn't get along well with them. He thought they were kind of cynical and crass. And his desire was to see places that hadn't been reached with the gospel. So he and this Reverend William Burns started doing expeditions inland. But very quickly, Taylor realized that his appearance was really the only thing being noticed. So he decided to dress like a Chinese person and cut his hair and put a pigtail and dyed it black, and kind of burned his hair in the process. He said he had quite a hard time the first time doing this, but he decided to dress like a Chinese person. And he said, well, it actually works a lot better for the climate, unsurprisingly. But he he then found that at least that barrier wasn't getting in the way, although the rest of the Westerners and missionaries really thought he was something else. They were not impressed at all. He also had been having troubles with finances in terms of the Chinese Evangelization Society was really sporadic in giving him his money. And by 1857, he cut ties with them. He said they had been acting shamefully. I mean, there also were the clashes with other missionaries, but he decided that he wanted to live by faith at this time, not depend on this society that disagreed with him quite a bit in terms of their goals. He believed that if God owned, everything was his, cattle on 1,000 hills, then he could trust God to provide for that which he called his people to. Now, of course, as per usual, there was a girl. This is kind of actually a funny reason for picking her. Hudson Taylor met Maria Dyer and thought she was quite a nice and impressive young lady, but also noticed that she had a bit of something off with one of her eyes. And he was fairly self-conscious, so thought maybe because she had this sort of issue with how she looked, he might be more likely to be able to actually marry her. She worked for Miss Aldersey, who had been one of the kind of early missionaries in China. Actually, she'd been the first single female missionary who had come during that student volunteer movement. She had been born in China, then had gone back to London for schooling, and then moved back to China with her sister when she was 15 to work in this school. Now, Miss Aldersey just thought Hudson Taylor was the worst. She thought he was low class and was a weirdo because of how he dressed and was just trying to get money and prestige by marrying Maria Dyer. So when he sent a proposal letter to her, she dictated a very harsh rejection letter. But both of them were quite interested in marrying each other. So one day when a big rainstorm had come, Hudson Taylor was walking, and one of their mutual friends kind of led him to be able to talk to Maria for a few minutes. And he basically asked, "Do you mind if I send a letter to your guardian in England to get engaged to you?" And she was very pleased. So in 1857, they got married. They worked alongside each other, were true partners. Around this same time, Hudson Taylor had to take over for a hospital for one of his dear friends, Dr. Parker, who had actually helped Maria through a series of significant sickness. He had to go home because of his wife's sickness, so Hudson Taylor took over this hospital in this time, and it really overwhelmed him. Maria was a great support, but they were biting off a little more than they could chew in these early days. With that said, there were letters from Hudson Taylor back to his mother at home saying how marriage was pure bliss, and that he understood the blessing and the love of God so much more, and how wonderful Maria was for him. This is the family of Hudson Taylor. On the left column there is the children with Maria. She died in 1870, so he married again, and then those other two children are his children from the next marriage. Now, during these days when first in China, he was preaching one day, and preaching on John 3. You look up to the snake, or the Israelites look up to the snake and found salvation. And for God so loved the world, he gave his only son, that whoever believed in him would never perish but have eternal life. And this Mr. Nee, who is a prominent businessman in the crowd, heard this and came up to Hudson Taylor and said, "This is what I've been looking for. This is the religion, the faith where I can find salvation and can find reconciliation with God." He said, "My father had been searching for this true God for his whole life." And he asked, "How long have you in England known about this?" Hudson Taylor, very shamefully, or feeling burdened by this question, said, "Well, we've known for hundreds of years." And Mr. Nee said, "Well, how have you not come before and told us? My father searched for this his whole life and died without finding it. Why didn't you come sooner?" And this haunted Hudson Taylor. It stuck with him for the rest of his days, thinking of the millions or hundreds of millions of people in inland China who may be in a similar experience to Mr. Nee's father. Mr. Nee was gripped by the gospel and within the next couple of days, shared the news about Jesus with this man named Wang, who was a basket maker. And Wang took this faith very seriously. He told his employer he would have to take off Sundays because he worked 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. His employer was very mad and told all the basket makers not to hire him on Monday when he came looking for a job. So Wang, the basket maker, went out and started preaching and sharing about what had happened. He grabbed tracts and gone to tell people. And this farmer named Wang came to town to because a dream had led him there, and to find what this true religion was. And he met Wang, the basket maker, and came to know Jesus. And then this basket maker on Tuesday went back to work because the person who had kind of boycotted him forgot to say days beyond Monday. So all the basket makers were happy to hire him on Tuesday. And Wang, the basket maker, was going to make baskets for this man who wanted little baskets made for his idols. And he said, no, I can't do that. I serve the true God. I won't make baskets for idols. And this painter heard from kind of behind a wall in the other room. So came and talked with him after. And he also came to faith. It actually came to be Hudson Taylor's close sort of colleague and assistant, to the point that when Hudson Taylor went to England the next year, Wang the painter came with him. So in 1860, Hudson and Maria and Wang returned to England because Hudson had been sick, and they were aware that they needed some more training. That time as hospital administrators had really overwhelmed them. So Hudson Taylor completed courses in chemistry, midwifery, and surgery, worked with Wang and another missionary on the Ningpo New Testament, revising the current edition, along with writing a book called China, Its Spiritual Needs and Claims, to inspire others toward missionary work in China. While back in England, he felt convicted by God that, to take this ministry inland, but no mission board would go with him. So in 1865, while recuperating in Brighton, he felt God calling him to pray for 24 willing laborers to go 2 by 2 into the 11 unreached provinces in China and into Mongolia. And within a few days, he deposited the few pounds that he had in his wallet into a new bank under the name Chinese Inland Mission. This responsibility was heavy for him, especially because he had trusted God for finances before, but now he was having to think about doing this with a whole group of people. What if God didn't come through? His method was to pray to God to send forth laborers, and then to pray for the church to grow in spiritual life, that they might see the need and be unwilling and unable to stay. He believed that if he was seeking first the kingdom, seeking God and his righteousness, then the other things would be able to be provided. And this was answered. They found other missionaries, to the point in which, when they left in 1866 or 1867, they had the largest missionary party ever to go to China, 16 people plus their family. When at services, Taylor did not want an offering made. In fact, this Colonel Puget had argued with him and told him how terrible of an idea this was at a service he was running. Basically said, no, you have these people convicted. You need to pick up an offering. And Hudson Taylor said, no, they need to deal with God. And that night, Colonel Puget had gone home and couldn't sleep, just thinking about the millions of people in China and their need for the gospel. And he actually said to Hudson Taylor the next morning, God convicted me. I was going to give 5 pounds into the offering, but I feel like I need to give substantially. This is an important thing, and these people are important. So he gave a 500-pound check to Hudson Taylor, which was enough to pay for a boat that had just come available to take their whole team to China. The boat was called the Lammermuir. Now, this party of 16 unexperienced missionaries and the Taylor family, with Hudson Taylor only being in his early 30s as their missionary statesman, everyone thought this was just foolhardy and certain that they would fail. But they believed that their Heavenly Father would provide for them. They didn't want the kind of imperial strength to protect them, but they wanted to go with God. a few criticisms that were came against them quickly, because there were a few significant kind of infighting, and to the point where one of the missionaries left the mission quickly. And he accused Hudson Taylor of kissing the single missionary women to bed before they went to bed, and being polygamous, which was kind of shown not to be the case. But there was some strife early on within this party. In 1868, the mission house they were at was attacked. Maria barely escaped with her life. And this attack really damaged the prestige of CIM, because a newspaper in London sort of blamed them of warmongering, though they were entirely peaceful and pacifistic. And around this time, Hudson Taylor was really feeling downtrodden, to the point in which one of his biographers suggested that he may have been feeling suicidal, and that Maria's support for him was one of the only things that got him through this time. But a letter from one of his missionary colleagues reminded him of John 4, and the idea of abiding within in the vine and Jesus being sufficient. And this totally changed Hudson Taylor's life. For the rest of his days, he looked back on 1869, this time when he was going through this dark night of the soul, and God's answer in this time as a really significant experience for his faith and life in Christ. In 1870, Maria died. It was a terrible year. They called it the worst year of Hudson Taylor's life. He lost his son Samuel, and then Maria had been pregnant. She died, or the child died 2 weeks after being born, and then Maria died a few days after that of cholera. So he returned home to see his children. One of his colleagues went with him, Jenny Falding, and actually the missionaries kind of thought he'd probably go back and marry this other missionary, Emily, who had been caring for the kids. But by the time they got home, Hudson Taylor was engaged to Jenny Falding, and she ended up being his wife until the year before he died. But during these days, his focus on the mission really, or his focus didn't change, but his workload really changed. He got more involved in an administrative role. He kept going back to China and back and forth to England, to the point where by his death, it's estimated that he probably spent 6 or 7 years on boats because of all the back and forth trips, 10 trips to China. So his workload really changed. He, in between 1880 and 1881 and 1890, it's estimated that he and Jenny spent 6 years of that time apart, because she was in England and he was traveling so much. But China Inland Mission completely changed the way that missions happened in China. They reached toward the interior. By 1882, all 11 provinces that had been closed before had Chinese inland missionaries into that place, and 8 of them had missionaries who were residents. By the time Hudson Taylor died, a fifth of the missionaries in China were with CIM. And an interesting and really encouraging idea is that they were the most cooperative servant organization. That Hudson Taylor really took seriously the idea of working with other missionaries, that by any means possible, the gospel might go out. Their ideas about money were that God would provide. This did become a little bit of a critique later on, once they had publications flowing out about what God was doing, because they had lots of money flowing in, but they still sort of saw themselves as a poor faith organization, which does sort of beg to question, at what point are you relying on God, and at what point is God providing in a different way? But they always spoke as though they needed God's provision in the day, which we do, but even when there were millions of dollars flowing through their organization. Some of Hudson Taylor's key writings, these first 2 are about China and its need for the gospel. Separation and Service is really an interesting book. It's only 45 pages, and it's really neat. He basically allegorizes the Nazarite vow in number 6 as the Christian life, and then talks about the threefold blessing at the end of number 6 as a Trinitarian blessing, and then sees the service in number 7 as sort of the offering to God, and why God is so pleased with that. Union and Communion is really interesting, because that's his thoughts on the Song of Solomon. Of course, as with many people throughout Christian history, he allegorized this as Christ and the church. But he wrote this while pining over Maria Dyer. So that was kind of interesting. And one with Christ's reflections on his experience of kind of spiritual renewal in 1869. Arthur Glasser said, Hudson Taylor was ambitious without being proud. He was biblical without being bigoted. He was Catholic without superficial, and was charismatic without being selfish. What a apt description of a man who seek to be more like Jesus in each way, in each day. In 1905, Hudson Taylor died in south of Lake, which is Wuhan. It was the last province that CIM ended up with missionaries in. And he said, there's nothing small and nothing great. Only God is great. Don't need to worry about, something being too small or too great. There is a living God. He has spoken in his word. He means what he says. He is willing and able to perform what he has promised.